Starting off invoking the Guru Parampara. Om Tad Paramparaya Vidmahe Jnanalingeshwaraya Dhimahi Tanno Guruh Prachodayate Om Yoga Maharshi Dr. Swami Geetananda Giri Guru Maharaj Ki Jai. The purpose of today's session is to a bit of a mop up, in the sense that in the first 6 weeks of our step-by-step, there have been areas Swamiji has talked about: the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. Yet, due to the necessity of spending more time on the yogic component, I have not been able to spend time on the anatomy and physiology of cardiorespiratory systems. Hence, I thought it necessary that we have some study material, and so I have shared one of the e-books we created of study materials that has a lot of good stuff in it. I only claim to have compiled it because it is not all my original work, it is a compilation. And I'm very clear whether I'm the author or the compiler. And for that ebook, I'm only the compiler, not the author. Try to give credit whenever possible. Sometimes when I don't know where to give it, I may miss it. So a few years ago, I was invited by Joseph LePage, the founder of the Integrative Yoga Therapy, one of the most dedicated yoga therapy training programs I have known. And he invited me to be a faculty on his program being run at Kripalu in Massachusetts. And so for 2 years, it was alternate years, I went into Montreal, and thanks to Aishwarya and Radu, got a ride down to Stonebridge and had a wonderful time with Joseph, his team, and the beautiful students who have become part of my yoga family. At that time, he said, I want you to cover what you think is important for a yoga therapist from the perspective of respiratory, cardiovascular, digestive, psychoneurology. So he gave me these options. And so one session per day for about 2.5 hours or 3 hours, I was teaching. And so I prepared some PowerPoint presentations at that time. These were also part of my being a visiting faculty member at Kaivalya Dhamma. So now I am one of those vagabond vagus nerve yogacharyas, because I am a visiting faculty at Kaivalya Dhamma for many years, visiting faculty at SVyasa Yoga University in Bangalore now, and also part of the visiting faculty at Sri Sri University in Odisha. And already I was a visiting faculty at Moraji Desai National Institute for Yoga in Delhi. So I have been, like the vagus nerve goes all over and helps people calm down. I think I have been trying to go all over and help people calm down a bit through the vagal parasympathetic tone. Because of that, I created these PowerPoints. And so the other day I was thinking I should make a video, and then I'm like, okay, I can just share my PowerPoint. And I'm like, your PowerPoint without you makes no sense. And I'm like, you're just going to be giving them 17, 18 slides that mean nothing. They can get it off the net. So I said, okay, I better make a recording. And then this idea came together that as a Diwali special bonus, we will have today's session. So that is how this happened. And sorry for the short notice, but everybody is going to get a copy of this video so people can catch up. So hopefully nobody loses out at all. We all stand to gain. Let's start with the share screen. And yes, are you able to see my slide? Screen share? Perfect, good. So we start off with the respiratory system because Swamiji has made it very clear that is where life starts and that is where yoga starts. And in step by step, he said where to start. He said, well, the first thing you have to do in life is breathe. That first breath of life is where life starts. So yoga starts with the first breath of life. And I love the quote attributed to Sri Deshikachar, where he said, if you can breathe, you can do yoga. And I think that's a beautiful quote because many people think, oh, I am not flexible, I cannot do yoga. You know, I'm a bit obese, I cannot do yoga. I cannot touch my knees, I cannot do yoga. You know, I don't belong to a cult, so I cannot do yoga. You know, I don't have a big, fat, long bearded guru, so I cannot do yoga. You know, you have all these weird reasons why people should not do the very thing they need to do. So the concept that all you need to be able to do is breathe actually. And this has been again and again reiterated whenever we visit the intensive care unit and post-surgery, where people are barely conscious and all they can do is actually breathe. They cannot even move much. And we get a referral for yoga therapy. And people in the intensive care look at us and they're like, what are you people doing here? And we say, we are here to help the people breathe better. And it's amazing. You get the person to start to breathe better. You get them out of that intensive care faster. You get them into recovery faster and you get them out of the hospital. That is the most important part, faster. The longer you stay in the hospital, the worse your prognosis is. Full stop. So get out of the hospital. Even in hospitals, we want daycare surgery. They come in the morning, get them out before it sunsets so that you don't get nasocomnial infections and you don't have what is called iatrogenic disorders. These are the ones created by us doctors, okay? Iatrogenic disorders, look it up. It is one of the highest causes of deaths, much bigger than even COVID-19, okay? I'm not playing down COVID-19 because it has taken away many of my beloved ones, and I offer my deep condolences to Rama Reddy sir on your brothers passing away because of COVID. I offer my condolences to so many people who I know in my own circle. Yesterday, I lost a very dear friend who was a staunch Hindu supporter and ran the Ganesh Chaturthi for 40 years in Pondicherry. And we lost him to COVID-19. So I'm not downplaying it. But just imagine there is a condition worse than COVID. And that is called iatrogenic disorders, which is doctor-created disorders, medical team-induced disorders. And it's not to blame the doctors, but that is what happens in these systems. So get the people out, teach them how to breathe. So the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system, very simple diagrams I've tried to collect. It all starts with your nose, the nasal passage that connects to the back, which is called the pharynx. And this pharynx connects your nasal passage and the oral passage. So your nose and your mouth both on the inside, the end in the same place. And that is why that is often called the nasal pharynx and oropharynx. Naso-oropharynx is basically the back of the opening of the nostrils, the back of the opening of the mouth into the throat. And this is taken advantage by yogis in doing what is called Jalaneti and Sutraneti. So we put a tube into the nose, take it out the mouth, and then start cleaning because we know that these openings are connected. And an amazing practice for nasopharyngeal health. Naso-oropharyngeal health. Neti, it's a lifesaver. Recently, we published some work on that, and the Brahmari, the Neti, well, seriously, Nasosynovitis will be a past tense with those type of practices. So this connection, and that is why people get confused. Do I breathe in through my mouth or do I breathe in through my nose? And in general, nose is for breathing, mouth is for eating and talking. Okay, this is basically how it is divided. Nose is for breathing and smelling, mouth is for eating and talking. Don't try to smell through your mouth. Don't try to talk through your nose. Okay, you know, a few things you have to, and don't eat through your nose unless you are in hospital and need a nasal gastric tube to feed you, which is not a good idea. So whenever in doubt, breathe, talk, eat. Don't eat through the nose and don't unnecessarily breathe through the mouth. There are very specific practices in yoga where you breathe in or out through the mouth. They are very specific. They have a specific rationale. Otherwise, you do not do it. They are very specific practices. The cooling pranayamas, Shitali, Sitkari, Sadanta. You breathe in through the mouth. That is the one place. The other place, when we do Kukriya pranayama, again a specific practice. Mukha Bastrika. These are very specific. Or Bhujangini Mudra. These are very specific practices that are exceptions to the rule. They are not the rule. So whenever in doubt, remember you breathe through the nose. And the reason is the nose has the ability to filter the air you are breathing, which does not exist in the mouth. So the nose, the nostrils filter most of the stuff that you don't want into your lungs. Your mouth doesn't do it. So if you breathe through your mouth, you are losing out on the entire filtering system that exists in the nose. The first point. The second thing is when the air comes to the nose, there is a temperature maintenance done to the air, which doesn't happen when you do through the mouth. Through the nose, there's a regulation of the temperature of the air, the humidification of the air, and the filtration of the air. So 3 reasons you want to breathe through your nose and not your mouth. Mouth breathing is both a sign as well as the effect, the cause and effect of disease. If somebody is breathing primarily through the mouth, either they are going to cause a disease or they already have a disease. This is basically how you will take it. Either the adenoids are already blocking the nostril, which is one of the commonest reasons kids have mouth breathing. And Swamiji used to say mouth breathing leads to intelligent quotient deficiencies. And if you look at children who have intellectual challenges, you will see most of them are mouth breathers. It is a very common thing we have seen in Divyanga Yoga. There's a lot of the children who are mouth breathers who are intellectually challenged. Which is the cause, which is the effect, we don't know. So if you can get the kids to breathe through the nose, you are creating a healthy future. One more reason to breathe through the nose. Let's come back now. So here we have this connection. It then comes down into the trachea, the larynx, and the trachea. The trachea has this Adam's apple. This Adam's apple out here, which is basically your larynx. And this is a very important part because this cartilage out here is protective cartilage. The cartilage on the front of your respiratory passage is there to protect the respiratory passage from damage. If somebody tries to cut your throat, it is there to try and protect you. If you get injured, it tries to protect you. Because your respiratory passage is in front, the digestive passage, the esophagus, is behind it. And so you have this cartilage at the top portion as a protective part to again keep the passage open. You want the passage to be open. So what do you do if you want it to be open? put some cartilage there so that it cannot collapse. The rest of the passageways, the smaller passageways can collapse, but this part cannot collapse because of the cartilage. Nature doesn't want this part to collapse. Why doesn't it want it to collapse? One is to keep you breathing. Second is the vocal apparatus. Your speech box is in here. This is where you have the vocal cords. And so you want to have a stable system in which the vocal cords can move so that you can speak and you can communicate. So it is not just by chance you have this. The cartilage is vital for structural integrity, to prevent the collapse, to give safety, and enable the communication apparatus to function normally as much as possible. Now, as that trachea comes down, then it starts to lose the cartilage, because now once it's inside your chest, you have the rib cages to protect you. The rib cage will protect you. You don't need further protection. So you don't have cartilage there. Nature is very intelligent. There was some time back, somebody called it intelligent design. That, it wasn't God and it wasn't all that. They called it intelligent design. Nature has a very intelligent design behind everything. There is nothing that is without a purpose in our body. It's amazing the way it is designed. So you need protection here. After that, you don't need it. So there's no cartilage. And that is where the trachea divides into the two bronchi. And these bronchi then keep dividing into multiple bronchioles. So the bronchi are the big ones. Bronchiole is the small ones. Later on in cardiovascular, we'll say artery, arteriole, vein, venule. Those are the small ones. So the bronchiole is the small one. The bronchi are the big ones. And the biggest one are called the principal bronchi. So you have the right and left principal bronchi that come into the right and left lungs, and then they keep on dividing. And then you have the right and left lungs, you have the heart, which is in the center, a bit towards the left, and then below that, you have the diaphragm, and you have the ribs protecting the whole lung. This is the general structure here. Now, if you go inside, you can see the trachea, the right and left principal bronchus, that then divides into lobar bronchus, segmental bronchus, and it keeps dividing until around 20 levels of division. There are at least 20 levels of division in this tracheobronchial tree. The trachea and the bronchiole, you have a tracheobronchial tree, and you have the terminal bronchiole. The terminal bronchiole, and then what is called respiratory bronchiole, and then come the alveoli. Now, just to contrast this, imagine a tree. With a tree, what do you have? You have the trunk. So you have the trunk of the tree, which is like your trachea. The trunk of the tree is the trachea. Then that trunk of the tree has two main branches, 2 or 3 main branches, here 2 big branches. Then those big branches have smaller branches. Those smaller branches have even smaller branches. And they have final twigs, small twigs. And then at the tip, you have all the beautiful leaves. You don't have leaves on the trunk, okay? You don't have leaves on the major branch. You have leaves at the terminal ends of the branches. The smallest branches are the ones which have the leaves. Similarly, you turn it upside down. You have the trachea. You can see the trachea with all the cartilage rings, the right and left bronchus. They keep on dividing, and finally you have the alveoli, which are like our leaves. The leaves of the tree help the tree to respire. Our alveoli help us to respire. That is the way this is working. And the alveoli, they look a lot like broccoli. That is why broccoli, cauliflower are good examples of what your lungs look like. Hold a broccoli or cauliflower upside down and you have your lungs in your hand. It's very, very similar. In the tip, the small bits on the tip, they are like your alveoli. It's a good way to get an organic feel of what the lungs are like. Otherwise, with diagrams, you miss it. Now, in this whole structure, if you look at the larynx, you have the cartilage and all. This whole region here, so the trachea and all the divisions, what happens is that till about the 17th level of division, I told you there are about 20 levels of division. Up to about 17th level, it is called the conducting zone. And this conducting zone, what happens is that the air is being conducted from the nostrils to that region without any exchange occurring. There is no gaseous exchange occurring. The mouth, nose, pharynx, trachea, glottis, larynx, and bronchi, up to that 17th level, they are just carrying the air. Now, after that, you have what is called the respiratory zone, where you have the terminal bronchiole, which is part of conducting, the respiratory bronchioles, and then those alveoli. The respiratory bronchiole, alveolar duct, alveoli are where the exchange is occurring. The process of respiration is happening in the respiratory zone. It is not happening in the conducting zone. All the air in the conducting zone is just being transported, and that is called the dead space. The dead space, because it is not doing anything. It is just going from the tip of your nose to that region without any exchange of gas. Respiration is technically defined as exchange of gases. Respiration is the exchange of gases, and that is only happening in the respiratory zone. The conducting zone doesn't have it. It's a bit like any wind instrument, like a trumpet. If you play a trumpet or any of these wind instruments, there's this whole region that is just conducting the air, and then there is the respiratory zone. That is where the actual adaptation occurs for the music to be produced. So you can think of any wind instrument, and you will know the conducting zone and the respiratory zone from the wind instrument. A pipe, clarinet, any of these instruments, you have that conducting zone, and then the area where the exchange occurs is where you're playing with your fingers. And you are creating an exchange between what is in the pipe and what is outside the pipe, creating music. The same thing happens here. So the actual respiratory zone is only the last portion. Up to that, it is only conducting zone. So if you look at this, the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles is all conducting zone. The respiratory zone is only the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar duct, and alveolar sac. And if you look at these, this diagram really breaks it down very, very nicely. And you will see that you have one trachea, 2, then 4, then 8 bronchi, then multiple bronchioles and all. Alveolar sac, that's 6 into 10 to the power of 8. Now that's a huge number, okay? It's into the millions when you think about it. The alveoli you have, the alveoli in one lung can be spread over a full football field, okay? That's the surface area of one lung's alveoli. And the cilia are only in the conducting zone because it is to prevent any unwanted stuff from getting into your lungs. Smooth muscle only in the beginning. Cartilage only in the trachea. Once you come into the lower part, no trachea, so it can move better, it can contract better. And by the time you come to the alveoli, you have pure gas exchange, nothing else happening at the alveoli. That is why you want to get your whole breath right down into those alveoli and have that exchange occurring. Only happens if you deep breathe. Otherwise, you're not going to get that happening. So if you look down at the alveoli, this is a nice diagram. It looks like, a cluster of grapes packed up in a supermarket in one of those nets they have. It's something like that. Someone sent me an image of bananas and oranges packed with plastic and said, nature goes to so much trouble to have natural packing. And we humans then, peel it and again pack it in plastic. Oh, what an idiotic set of featherless bipeds we have become. Nature has its own packing. As I told Amma yesterday, tailless lizards we have become. Tailless lizards, headless chickens, featherless bipeds. You see here this is where you have the bronchus, the respiratory bronchiole and all, and then you have the alveoli. And the smallest blood vessels called capillaries. The capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. They form a mesh around the alveoli. So you have the alveoli and they are covered on all sides by the capillaries, so that the alveoli and the capillaries, they're right next to each other. So the exchange can occur between the lungs and the bloodstream. So beautifully designed. Human beings cannot design anything like this. And this is so beautifully designed by nature. This amazing intricacy. And that is where I am just seeing if I can find, no, okay, I don't have it here. I thought I had a cut section of this, maybe it's later, where you see that the wall of the alveoli and the wall of the capillary are right next to each other. And that is why the exchange can occur. Oxygen from the alveoli into the blood, carbon dioxide from the capillary into the alveoli, because they are right wall to wall. They are next to each other, just like this. And the walls are like 1 cell thick. 1 cell thick. The capillaries 1 cell thick, alveoli 1 cell thick, and they're next to each other. And that is where the exchange occurs. Amazing setup. And we are talking into millions and millions of alveoli with billions and millions of capillary cells interacting just to keep us alive. We better make this life worth it, okay? These millions of alveoli and capillaries are working so hard to keep us alive, and what do we do with this life? That is our dharma, to live to the best of our ability and make all the efforts worth it, right down to ourselves. Okay, now coming to another aspect, breathing involves 2 processes, inhalation, exhalation. So this whole process of breathing in, the diaphragm contracts and flattens. The volume in the thoracic cavity is increased because the diaphragm comes down. The lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs is decreased, and because of less pressure in the lung, the air from outside rushes into the lungs. This is actually what we are doing. The diaphragm contracts and flattens, volume increase, lungs expand, pressure in the lungs has gone down. The pressure in the lungs is less than the pressure outside in the atmosphere. Air rushes in. This is how inhalation occurs. When you have filled your lungs completely, the respiratory center says, okay, that's enough. You can breathe out now. And so what happens? The diaphragm expands and relaxes back. Volume in the thoracic cavity decreases. The lungs compress. The air pressure in the lung is increased and air rushes out. The whole process is basically driven by the diaphragm. And this is why I don't care how people describe this. The diaphragm drives your inhalation. The diaphragm drives your exhalation. And that is why both inhalation and exhalation, the focus must start at the diaphragm, because it is the most important muscle. It drives both inhalation and exhalation. The rest of the muscles are helping it. The primary muscle is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm goes down, volume increases, pressure falls, air rushes in. The diaphragm comes up, volume decreases, pressure goes up, air rushes out. It is a pressure-volume relationship in your thoracic cavity that drives the whole process. What changes the volume? The movement of the diaphragm up and down. And that is why the diaphragm is so important in our understanding of the breathing. So if you look at this diagram, you'll see before inhalation, the air pressure in the lungs is equal to the atmospheric pressure. Basically, theoretically, you have a moment where the pressure inside the lung and outside the lung, P air and P lung, are the same. Now what happens? So they have said P lung is equal to P air. It's a bit simplistic, but it's good. Now diaphragm contracts and comes down, chest cavity expands, and so now pressure in the lung is less than the pressure of the atmospheric air, and inhalation occurs. Okay, during inhalation, diaphragm contracts, chest cavity expands downward and outward, increases volume of the chest cavity, reduces the air pressure, and air from outside the body comes into the lungs. This is what is happening. Now, during exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, decreasing the volume of the chest cavity. Pressure increases in the lungs, forcing the air out. Now, P lung is more than P air. So before you are breathing, P lung is equal to P air. When the diaphragm goes down, P lung is less than P air. And when you breathe out, P lung is more than P air. The pressure volume relationship is driving this whole thing. What drives the pressure volume relationship? The movement of the diaphragm. And that is why in this system, we always have given importance that breathing in, you focus on low, mid, high. Breathing out, you focus on low, mid, high. Because both processes, the driving force is the diaphragm. Now people get confused. They say, oh, does the air molecule first come into the upper part of the lungs or the lower part of the lungs? We are not talking of the air molecules. That is not what we are talking about. We are talking about awareness of the process. As Swamiji has said, awareness of the body, awareness of emotion. You are becoming aware of a natural process to use that process as it should be to the best of its ability. So the natural process is muscle driven. And so it is not about, people get confused. They say, oh, when you breathe out, the air at the top has to go out first. Yeah, the air at the top will go out first, but what is driving the whole process? They're forgetting the process, and people get caught up with air molecules. It's not about air molecules. It is about being aware of the process. Adama, Madhyama, Adhyama is a focus on the process, not the air molecule. The air molecule is secondary. The process is primary. It is like, which is more important, the means or the goal? The means are more important than the goal always. The means are more important. The process is more important. Yoga is a process. Yoga is also the goal, but yoga is a process. And that is why the process is the goal. People forget about it. The journey is the experience that you're looking for. People want to get to the end without the journey. No use. The whole journey is the process. That is what yoga is, and that is what the goal is. The goal is the journey itself. It's a very interesting paradox, actually, when you think about it. I love thinking about this paradox because, you know, yoga is both the process as well as the end. It's both. And that is why, you know, yoga as what we are doing as well as what we are being. It's a very interesting aspect, actually. So again, another diagram that gives this in a very nice way, where they have talked about how when you breathe in, the diaphragm goes down. The other day, we had a very nice short video of a few seconds made by Kim on this. The diaphragm contracts, goes down, the ribs expand outwards, and you breathe in. So basically, down, out, up, 360 degree, and you breathe in. And then this dotted line is where it was. Now the diaphragm relaxes. Look at the difference between when the diaphragm is contracting and when it is relaxing. There's a huge difference between image 1 and 2. There's a huge difference. And you'll see that the chest also comes back, diaphragm relaxes. No wonder the volume decreases, pressure increases. This is called Boyle's law, B-O-Y-L-E-S. Boyle was the scientist, B-O-Y-L-E. Go and look it up. Pressure and volume are inversely proportionate to each other. When volume goes up, pressure goes down. When reverse it and you get it. Day to night, night to day, as we say in the Bhagavad Gita, for the yogi and common man, pressure and volume are like that. It's like the time zones in North America and India. That's all. What is day to one is night to the other. Simple as that. And that is what drives this whole process. Again, I have talked a lot about this, and I've sent you a video also, how I've talked about when you do deep breathing, you are getting more by doing less work. So it is economical and it is efficient, because the dead air space, you remember that conducting zone? In the conducting zone, there's no exchange. Because there's no exchange, that is never being used. So it is like your income tax or your tax deduction at source. And so what happens is, the more you have transactions, the more tax you pay. And here what you are doing is reducing your transactions and reducing the dead air space transaction, and 5,100 ventilation down to your alveoli with 6 breaths, as opposed to 4,200 with 12 breaths and 1,500 with 30 when you are shallow breathing. So you can definitely see that shallow breathing is much ado about nothing. Shallow breathing is much ado about nothing. And you don't want that to happen. Yoga karmasu kaushalam, says Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Yoga is skill in action. Deep breathing is skillful breathing. Shallow breathing is non-skillful, wasteful breathing. Now let's take that. The breath is equal to the mind. Deep thinking is good. Shallow thinking is not good. Huh? Same thing with the breath. And you have people who are shallow breathers and shallow thinkers abounding on this planet. If we can get them to deep breathe, maybe we can make them think a bit deeper. I don't mean thinking deeply about your problems. What I mean is thinking deeper about the purpose of life. And there's a big difference. Thinking deeper about your problems is digging your well deeper. That many people do that very well. They are very good at making a molehill into a mountain. Yoga makes mountains into molehills, okay? Here we have a very beautiful diagram. This is the one I was looking for. And if you look at this diagram, you will see here in this first one here, the alveoli, the wall. And here you have the capillaries where you have the hemoglobin in the RBCs. These red flying saucers or donuts. Red donuts are your RBCs, red blood corpuscles. They are the red cells that have hemoglobin and carry the oxygen, carbon dioxide, and all that stuff. And you can see here how that carbon dioxide is going from the red blood cells in the plasma of the capillary through the thin cells. See, one cell on this side, one cell on that side. That's all. The alveoli, you have that one cell. The capillary, you have one cell, and this exchange is occurring here. And here, this is at the tissue level. Now, to explain that, I think I better come back to one more point. What happens is when we talk of respiration, we talk of internal and external. Now, this diagram also talks about intermediate, which doesn't really exist, but they give it also. External respiration is the exchange of gas. Remember, respiration, exchange of gas? The exchange of gas that is occurring in your lungs between your alveoli and the capillaries. So in your lungs, between the alveoli and the capillaries, the exchange of gas. The alveoli are giving oxygen to the capillary. Capillary is giving carbon dioxide to the alveoli. This is external respiration. Now this blood is pumped by your heart. This is why I said the heart and the lungs have to be seen together. The heart pumps the blood, the left heart. That is why oxygen is going through the left heart. So they have called this the intermediate respiration part, which doesn't really exist, but they have called it that. to the tissues, and now at the tissue, you have internal respiration, where the oxygen in the blood goes into the tissues. So here you see a cell. So the capillary is now taking the carbon dioxide from the tissues. This is what is happening here. So the carbon dioxide, this is being very simplistic. It's in carbon, it's in combined form in carbonic anhydrase. There's a whole science behind this. For simplicity, I'm just saying carbon dioxide waste product of the tissue is given to the capillaries, and oxygen from the capillaries is given to the tissues. Where is this happening? Internally, in your body. It is called internal respiration. That capillary carries the blood now back to the right heart. So carbon dioxide is carried back to the right heart, pumped to the lungs, external respiration occurs, and now the carbon dioxide is expelled, oxygen is brought in, again the process goes on. Internal respiration is happening at the tissue level, external respiration is happening at the lung level. Both of them are exchange of gas. In the lung, external respiration, oxygen from the alveoli to the capillaries. Carbon dioxide from capillary to the alveoli. This is in the lung. Switch the mode to the internal respiration at the tissue level. Second diagram. The tissues are giving the carbon dioxide to the capillaries. Capillaries are giving oxygen to the tissues. That is happening at the tissue level. It is called internal respiration. And the carriage, this diagram is calling the oxygen carried by the left heart to the tissues as the one component, carbon dioxide from the tissues back to the right heart as the second component of intermediate respiration. So they have tried to divide it into three. This intermediate, there's not much exchange actually happening. It is only carrying. So you have what's happening in the lungs is external respiration. What's happening at tissues is internal respiration. And this is why I say Patanjali was a physiologist. Because Patanjali, when he talks about pranayama, says there are two types of pranayama. He says there is the bahya, the external, and abhyantara, the internal. So I say Patanjali has talked of external respiration and internal respiration, calling it bahya and abhyantara. Now I don't think he really meant it, but it's worth thinking of it that way. And then he says stambha vritti, where nothing is happening. Maybe that is that intermediate respiration. But I just like to think about it this way, that when you understand the Yoga Sutras in a different angle, you start to see how all of these connections happen. When you breathe in and hold the breath, that is kumbhaka, or antara kumbhaka or kumbhaka. This is the retention of the breath. You are giving more chance for that external respiration process to occur. When you breathe out and you hold what is called bahya kumbhaka, or the shunyaka, or the suspension of the breath, you are giving more chance for the internal respiration in the tissues to occur. So the antara kumbhaka, when you hold the breath in, you are giving more chance for the external respiration at the lungs to occur. And when you do the bahya, you breathe out and you hold the breath out, you are giving more chance for your tissue level exchange to occur, because now the focus is not on the lung exchange, it's on the tissue level exchange. And suddenly you realize, if you want to enhance the tissue perfusion, that is the blood going into the tissues, bahya kumbhaka, that is the shunyaka, the held out breath, may have more benefits there than the held in breath. And there is a Dr. Malshe, Prakash Malshe. He is in Haridwar, and he does lot of quirky experiments, a very nice friend of mine. And I remember 4 or 5 conferences ago in Kaivalya Dharma, he gave a demonstration on stage of how doing this Bahya Kumbhaka, he had one of those pulse oximeters. Nowadays, everybody has one at home. He had one of those in those days. That was the first time I saw one of them out of a hospital setup. And he put on this pulse oximeter and he did what he called Kapalbhati and Bastrika. And then he did a prolonged Bahya Kumbhaka, holding the breath out on the exhalation. You breathe out and you hold. And he actually showed there was an increase in the oxygen saturation, which is very interesting. Normally, you think if you're not breathing, the oxygen saturation goes down. He actually showed there was an increase. It was very interesting. There wasn't much time in that conference for question and answer because we had 5 speakers to speak in 1 hour. So, he didn't really get interrogated more on that. But it is a very interesting thought. When you breathe out, and I have done this with my pulse oximeter recently, you breathe out. And actually it starts to go up. It doesn't go down. It's a very interesting thing. Your tissues are actually starting to use the oxygen that they have been given because they are not caught up in the circle all the time. They are being given a chance to get the most oxygen out of the system. It's a very interesting concept worth thinking. And again, many of these things are beautiful. This is fundamental research in yoga. You won't get much money for it. You won't get funding for it. That is a problem. But these are the things that really, really are interesting. And if you have access to some of this, try it out. It's worth trying out. Okay. I'm going to stop the share for a few moments to just check if there are any questions that I need to work on here. Okay. Let's get back a few moments. Okay. So, yes. So true. Okay, we have all of this coming. Yes, 3 upside down. So I have a question from Soundarajan. What is the right position for sleeping? This is a good question. One thing which we have started to find, and all emergency medical team know this, is if you're having people who are having trouble breathing, put them on the face. Face down, you are able to help the person breathe better. It is very interesting, and this has become one of the key go-to points in the COVID pandemic, that they have been saying if people are having low oxygen saturation, turn them on the face and it's helping the person. It's very interesting how this is happening. It is very, very interesting. I am postulating that maybe they are starting to then use the back of the lungs more, and parts that were not used are coming into play. It's a postulate, but it's worth thinking. Basically, we say that lie down on your left with the right side up, it opens your air passages. So the air passages open up better if your right nostril is dominant. But if you are not getting sleep and very stressed out, lie on your right with the left up to reduce your stress, because then you sleep better. So I think it depends individual to individual. The second part is, yes, Jalanethi Gitan is doing these days. And there's an interesting statistics, which I don't know where Jnanasundari got it. 60% of Americans are mouth breathers. I wonder where you got that statistic, but if you equate it, okay, I'm not going to get into politics, equate it with the voters on one side of the side, maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to get into that. Ananda, keep quiet. Okay. 15 shallow is opposite of 51 deep. That's a nice one. 51 deep, 15 shallow. Nice. Okay. Then Kumbhaka, yes. Laura has asked a question. The CO2 tolerance increases, absolutely true. Because what is happening in Kumbhaka is you are giving a chance for the carbon dioxide to build up. And your body starts to tolerate, and I will talk about this when we come to the brainstem mechanisms of respiration, because carbon dioxide levels in the blood are the most potent stimulator of the respiratory center. And so the moment there is more carbon dioxide in your system, you breathe more. This is basically how it's driven. And by holding the breath, Kumbhaka, you give a chance for a healthy buildup of carbon dioxide, which is a potent vasodilator. Carbon dioxide dilates the blood vessels, which means it can reduce your blood pressure. And one reason why Laura asked this is she has done a lot of work and published on hypertension and pranayama and yoga. Carbon dioxide buildup, now I'm not talking to a level of toxicity, but I'm talking about a healthy buildup of carbon dioxide, and tolerating it actually vasodilates. And so your blood pressure comes down and the flow of blood in your brain can increase. Flow of blood in the brain can increase. So maybe it is anti-aging also. It would be worth looking at this as an anti-aging Kaya Kalpa methodology also. So thank you for that. Why do we yawn through the mouth? Yes, Susan. Why do we yawn through the mouth has been always a big question, because it is not because we are oxygen deficient. If it was due to oxygen deficiency, we would breathe faster, that's all. So it is basically a signal that our body systems are tired and we need rest. That is actually what a yawn is signifying. It is telling us, for God's sake, go to bed. For God's sake, take some rest. And it is a protective mechanism. We looked at it when we talked about the Devadatta, the Upaprana-vayu, the subsidiary air called Upaprana-vayu, which is Devadatta, which is yawning. And it is protecting you by saying, don't overwork and burn the candle at both ends. There's a question about Kumbhaka. Does the pressure in the lung go down the more extreme my Uddiyana Bandha gets? This is a very interesting question, and I would have to think more about this, Mark. It's a very beautiful question. I don't know whether the pressure will change too much, because it's not that you are deficient of any gas. It's not a deficiency in the gas, because the oxygen, carbon dioxide, whether it is oxygen or whether it is carbon dioxide, the difference in volume and space may not be so much. So I think what is happening in the Kumbhaka is that you are actually getting an opportunity to go deeper into the practice. So you're doing the Uddiyana Bandha, and in that Kumbhaka, you are actually having a chance to go deeper, and that is why the Uddiyana is happening rather than volume changes. But I would like to refer back to some work done in the 1920s and 30s by Swami Kuvalayananda. He has done extreme work in Uddiyana Bandha, the pressures in the abdomen. He created the concept of Madhav Das vacuum. That is in honor of his guru, Swami Madhav Das Maharaj. And he created a term for that, a vacuum that is created when you do Uddiyana Bandha and all. And he called it, that vacuum, as Madhav Das vacuum. This is old research in Yoga Mimamsa. And I believe Kaivaladhamma gives you an option to buy soft copies of a compilation right from the first issue. Many years ago, I bought a CD where you had it, and then they made a PDF. It is worth looking at it. Amazing research. You don't find it on PubMed because Yoga Mimamsa never got indexed in PubMed, but it has better research than much of the yoga research on PubMed, I'll tell you that much. Especially in the 1930s to 1970s, that period especially. Amazing research from Kaivaladhamma. If you can find those issues of Yoga Mimamsa, amazing work on x-rays of the abdomen, x-rays of the lungs. In fact, Swami Digambarji, his whole health went down because of the amount of x-rays done by his guru on him. He became a victim of a lot of extra radiation. and his bones got spoiled and a lot of issues. But leaving that out of the picture, definitely there are some changes. So I will also look into it, Mark, because this is a beautiful question. And what I feel is the Kumbhaka enables us to go deep within ourselves, and hence the practice is becoming deeper. There may be some pressure changes, but I think it's more the space created for us to go deeper. That is what I feel. It's like in many asanas, if you go into the asana and like hold your breath for some time, you will feel you can actually go deeper into the asana. It may not be the pressure volume change. It may be more a psychological space you have created to go deeper into the practice. The more you think, the less space you have. The more you breathe, the less space you have. Slow down the breath, slow down the thoughts, and you have space in which something can manifest. Neeru has talked about that Udyana Bandha. Yes, it would be nice if you can share it with the team, maybe through the Facebook group. Amazing work. And as I've told you, I respect the work done by yoga at Kaivala Dhamma with Yoga Mimamsa in those days. Amazing work. Between 1930 to 1970 was the golden period of that work, way before you had all this PubMed indexed stuff. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to go into another concept here, which is important when we talk about the lungs. And that is our lung volumes and lung capacities. I hope you can see my slide now. Fine. So if you look at this, you will see that this is an old-fashioned graph, but it's easier to understand this one than the new ones, where you have the tidal volume. This part here is what happens when you just breathe in and breathe out normally. This is the tidal volume, just like the tide coming in and going out. And this is approximately 300 to 500 milliliters. This is why we normally say you're breathing 10% of your capacity. This is actually what we are talking about. Your tidal volume is just such a limited part. Now what happens is, despite this, you have a part which is inside. This is the capacity that you can breathe deeper if you want. And here, this is your capacity to breathe in deep. So you are breathing this normally. This is what you can breathe in if you need to. So 5 to 6 is where you have that. 5,000 to 600 milliliters is what you can do. Like if you were to do, you're just breathing and then you are, that's 5,000 to 6,000 you can get. Most people, you're lucky if you get to 4,000. We say 5,000, 4,000 is where most people are. I'll tell you the truth. And very rarely you get 5 and 6. It's technically there. Maybe a real good athlete will have it, not other people. Now, similarly, if you were to breathe out and you go, you can breathe out more. That is the amount you can breathe out. So, inspiratory reserve. So, you have the tidal volume. This is how much you're breathing. If you need to breathe in, you can breathe in. And if you need to breathe out, but most people don't do it. They never use this. They never use it because they're always like, that's where they are. And that is what pranayama teaches you to, and which is not taught normally. So pranayama is teaching you to become mindful of your inspiratory reserve volume and your expiratory reserve volume, which otherwise you are not being mindful. This is where, again, bringing awareness to aspects of our body function that we were not aware of, but in a positive way. Not in a diseased, negative way, but in a positive way. Now, similarly, this amount, that is the total here that you can breathe in if you want to. The total you can breathe out if you want to becomes what is called your vital capacity. So that is your, or rather, how much can you breathe in fully and breathe out fully? That becomes your vital capacity. And that should be about 5 liters. This is why normally we say people are breathing 1/10 of their capacity. They are breathing 500. They can breathe 5,000. So instead of breathing 5,000, they are satisfied breathing 500. This is what we mean when we say you are breathing 1/10 of your capacity. Earlier in one of our sessions, there was a question about this because it was understood that we are breathing 10% of what people used to breathe. It's not what people used to breathe. People have always been bad breathers. And that is why even the ancient yogis, Matsyendranath, Gorakhnath, they have talked about people being shallow breathers and the need for Dirgha Shwasa, that is deep breathing. They have talked about it even thousands of years ago. So our capacity is 5,000 when we want to, but we are breathing 500. And because people don't know their capacity, they are always only at that 500 threshold. Now what happens is you also have what is called a residual capacity. That is, after breathing out also, some air will be in your lungs. So you breathe out, your lung still has something called a residual volume. And this is important so that your lung doesn't collapse. Because if you were to breathe out completely and expel 100% of your air, your lungs would collapse. So again, nature is intelligent design. It said, these idiots will do anything and kill themselves. So put some residual volume to prevent them from killing themselves every time they breathe out. And they can kill themselves on that last out breath if they want, but not before that. Nature is benevolent. Nature is intelligent. I'll tell you, my whole medical studies reminded me how intelligent nature is. Amazing. You cannot think of the way nature has thought. Now this reserve volume is where you start to have what is called stale air. And because you are not breathing properly, you are always on your tidal volume, you end up with a lung that is having air. Your lung says, I have air in it, I don't need to breathe. And this is where air gets trapped in people's lungs, especially in asthma and other breathing disorders. And so the lung becomes hyperinflated as if it is already filled with air. And so the lungs say, I cannot breathe in anymore. And that is why one of the practices you are going to be learning soon in the step-by-step is called Mahamudra. This is not the Hatha Yoga Mahamudra. This is the Hatena Mahamudra, where we are going to be breathing out, bending forward, and then using the arms to go behind and pump out all that stale air, so that when you breathe in and come up, that hyperinflation is being deflated. It is an artificial hyperinflation. It is not a true hyperinflation. It is an artificial hyperinflation. You are deflating the stale air so that fresh air can come in. And this practice is one of the key practices for people with breathing disorders. The Mahamudra empties the lungs, enables the person to start filling the lung, because now the lung has come back to its normal. You are resetting your normal physiological system. Same thing with hypertension. You reset your reflexes. Your hypertension is happening because the reflexes have got confused. You are resetting those reflexes like resetting your clock. The reflexes have gone off. I'll talk about that when we come to cardiovascular. So you want to breathe out completely. And that is what happens when you do this. And so all of this together, your vital capacity and the residual volume becomes your lung capacity. That is what you can totally have, which is about 6 liters. But what is in your hand is about 5 liters, 5,000 milliliters. What you are using is less than 500. And that is why we say we are breathing less than 10% of our capacity, which is why there's also the concept we are using less than 10% of our brain capacity, which is also a good point. We have so much capacity and we are not using it. Now, how is this all controlled? I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty, but the main thing is that your brain stem is the respiratory center. what we call aprakasha bindu in the yogic terminology. And the sensors that are present there, there are baroreceptors, there are chemoreceptors, and they are sensing the carbon dioxide level, the oxygen level, and the acidity of your blood. These are the three things that determine how you breathe. The more the carbon dioxide, the more you will breathe. The less the oxygen, the more you will breathe. And the more acid you are, the more you will breathe. This is actually what pumps you up. And that is why shallow breathers start to become more acidic. Because they are acid, they start to breathe even more faster. Again in a shallow pattern, and you end up with this very shallow breathing that is producing acidity in the body. Slow deep breathing favors the alkalinity, the base level in the body. That is why slow deep breathing will harmonize your acid-base balance, acid-alkali balance in the blood. Shallow breathing makes you more acidic. And Swamiji used to say, of all the diseases that exist, 99% of the diseases are based on acidity in the body. He used to say 99% of the diseases in the human body are produced by acidity. Now, I'm not talking of acidity in your stomach, acidity in the blood. The change, your blood should be in a very good alkaline state. We are supposed to be alkaline. Now, as it shifts from that 7.2 plus, and it starts to come down, you become acidic. As you become acidic, you start to, you know what acid does? It destroys whatever it is in. You start to destroy every cell in your body. And there are very, very strong theories about acidity and cancer. Very strong theories that are very plausible. And one of the issues with the modern medical treatment of cancer is the chemotherapy, which pushes you even more acidic. And this is actually where there is a very big issue that comes up. And sometimes you really don't know what to do, because one of my aunts, she had cancer. She did all the conventional treatment and still died. Another aunt had cancer, did all the alternative therapies, and she also died. So I cannot tell you which is better. I lost two of Ammaji's younger sisters to cancer, and one of them took the allopathic modern pathway, one took the alternative pathway with juices and enemas and all the stuff that they advise. And both of them actually, it didn't help both of them to get rid of it. So I'm just putting it out there. There are thousands of therapies out there, but Swamiji's concept was diseases are acidic. And this is why he said you need to start breathing deep and proper to reduce the acidity of your own body systems, move you towards a more alkaline state, which is where healing occurs. The acidic state will not help you heal. The alkaline state helps you heal. So this is just to keep you in mind about that. So the more acid you become, the more you'll be stimulated. So if you look at this diagram again, it talks about here, you see the pons, the medulla. This is basically the brain stem here in pink on the diagram here. Then if you come here, you start to see how you have the peripheral chemoreceptors, decreased oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, and increased H ions, which means you're becoming acid. H ions becoming more means you are more acid, and your pH goes down. So H ions go up, your pH goes down. This is, so either just remember one of them, otherwise it's very confusing. And they stimulate your, they are the positive stimulator of the respiratory center in the pons and medulla. You then have the central chemoreceptors, which also work on it. The carbon dioxide increase and H ions, acidity going up. And then receptors in muscles and joints. That's why when you move your hands and feet more and more, you stimulate your respiration. So these are all the stimulators that are there. You then have stretch receptors in the lung. Remember, we talked about these receptors that are only activated when you breathe deep. And then you have irritant receptors, which whenever you inhale any toxic fumes, your lungs want to stop breathing to shut down. These are the negative parts. Okay. And then pain and emotional stimuli acting through the hypothalamus. They could be positive or negative modulators of your breathing pattern. And then you have the higher brain centers. This is what we are bringing in pranayama. Pranayama is all about the higher brain centers overcoming what is happening with all of these lower influences. All these lower influences, this is one of the best diagrams you can get when you think about this, how the respiratory system is given feedback. The higher brain centers, cortical centers, they are the place that they make the big difference, and that is where pranayama has to come from here, not any place else. Beautiful diagram that is there. Again, here you have another diagram talking about the same thing. Inadequate breathing, shallow breathing, increased blood CO2 concentration. So that decreases the blood pH, acidity, stimulates your peripheral chemoreceptors. The decreased cerebrospinal fluid, central chemoreceptors, and the pons and medulla increase the breathing. So this is actually what happens is, because you are not breathing properly, you are being asked to breathe more. But because again you are not breathing properly, you are caught in a vicious spiral towards ill health. So what do you start to do? Change the way you breathe. You change the way you breathe, suddenly you have changed this whole system. And that is where the effect of pranayama as being a regaining of the cortical control. That is, pranayama is not a breathing exercise. No. Pranayama cannot be just a breathing exercise, because it is not about what you are doing fast or slow breathing. It is about what is being done from here. And that is why if your pranayama is not mindful, it is not pranayama. Someone told me yesterday, he was actually Anand Raj's taekwondo master. He said one of his friends is a yoga teacher and started a studio called Mindless Yoga Studio. And he said he found that name very odd, but that the yoga teacher said, no, this people who know yoga will understand it. And I said, well, I know what that person wants to say. They want to say yoga studio that transcends the mind. But when you say mindless, it's actually muda, it's not niruddha. So I can understand, but we have to be very careful. There's a lot of mindless stuff going on. People, so, I have to breathe in. And I love the way this happens. I'm like, wow, nice shoulders. See, pranayama is what the choice you make here is what pranayama is all about. The choice being made in the higher center, changing the way you breathe, that then changes the way you feel, that changes the way you think, that then again sets up a positive spiral, as opposed to that diagram where we saw that negative spiral of faulty breathing. That is why you change the world one breath at a time. That is the truth, actually. One breath at a time. Let's come back to some questions here. I see that significance of chanting and breathing. Yes, this normally I like to talk about when I talk about, cardiovascular rhythms, actually. And I think cardiovascular is going to have to be another session, because this respiratory has taken up our time, and I'm going to take some more time on this. But I want to make sure you get as much as you can on this. It's not about shorts cutting anything. When you are using sound, nada or shabda, and you are breathing out, you can exhale longer with the sound. And this is very useful, because when you can exhale longer, you change the way your heart functions. So exhaling longer slows down the heart. This is actually one of the most important things about exhaling longer. It's not so beneficial for the respiratory system as such, but it is more beneficial for the cardiovascular system. And that is why if I were to say breathe in, and then I say let's breathe out for 2 or 3 times that amount. After that, I cannot. It's finished. But if I say let's breathe in, and now let's chant. That one exhalation was stretched so long by the addition of the sound. So the addition of the sound, this is a question that Kiran has asked. When you add sound to the exhalation, because you add the sound to the exhalation, you prolong the exhalation. Whenever you prolong the exhalation, you are regaining control over your cardiac autonomic function. The horses of the heart are brought under control when you exhale longer. Because inhalation is sympathetic driven, exhalation is parasympathetic driven. And metaphysically, if you think about this, all the stress comes when you breathe in and you are born. When you breathe out and you die, there's no stress, you're totally relaxed. So death is the final relaxation for the individual. Now, people left behind, we have problems. That's a different issue. But for that individual, you have no stress till you take that first breath of life, okay? And then all your stress starts. You're sympathetic. I have to keep breathing. Breathing out is a let go. Breathing out is a giving up of the tensions. It's parasympathetic. It's vagal tone. And that is why when you prolong the exhalation, you are prolonging the relaxed attitude. You are moving from type A personality to type B personality when you prolong the exhalation. You are moving from left brain dominant to right brain dominant when you prolong the exhalation. You are moving from sympathetic dominant to parasympathetic balanced when you prolong exhalation. That is where it comes in. So more than the respiratory system, the sound on exhalation benefits the cardiovascular system even more than respiration. Then there is a concept Bill has asked, when we do external kumbhaka and increased oxygen saturation, would this accompany the increased absorption of prana? I would say yes. Because for me, when something happens at the physical level, definitely something greater is happening at the non-physical level. This is my understanding. And what I like to say is, if you want to know whether you have good prana, feel your hands. If your hands are warm and circulation is good, there is good prana in your hands. If your hands are cold, definitely the energy is not flowing. The circulation reflects the energy flow. So now if you enhance the circulation, you do a bit of shaking, you do a bit of rubbing. When you enhance the circulation, vice versa, somatopsychic, you enhance the pranic flow. And that is why cold, clammy hands, one second. Cold, clammy hands signify less energy flow along with the stress. And what do? You make them warm and you reduce the stress. That is why we talk about warmth reducing stress, cold inducing stress. That is why even in stress in physiology, one of my first papers was published on cold pressure stress test, where you put your hand into ice cold water with ice cubes and your blood pressure goes up. It's called the cold pressure, cold pressure test, CPT. And we showed that 10 minutes of Shavasana can reduce that stress. If before that test you do Shavasana for 10 minutes, the blunting of your stress response is there. So whenever you know you are going to go someplace and get stressed out, do 10 minutes of Shavasana, you will be less stressed out than if you didn't do the Shavasana before it. That was the message. It was One of my first papers published in, I think, 2002 or something like that. So definitely, yes, I would go along with that. Okay. Then where are we? Okay, where are the Chin Bindu, Chinmaya Bindu, and Madhyam Bindu? In that respiratory center, the lower part, Chin, middle, Madhyam, and upper part will be the Adi. So Chin, Chinmaya, Adi. Naturally, medical science will not label it so. So you will not find it in a medical textbook labeled that way. But each of those areas, the lower part of the brainstem will be governing more of the lower part, the middle, and the upper part. So there is a sequential, every part, it's like when you look at the brain, the nervous system, there will be a sequence that is followed in the nervous system from bottom up in every part of the nervous system. So the same thing happens here also. And Mark has asked, does Brahmari allow the prolonged exhalation like chanting? Yes, absolutely. Brahmari is one of the best pranayamas for hypertension. And I think it was part of the protocol that Laura used in the practices. Was Brahmari part of it? I don't remember that. No, okay. We have done a lot of work on Pranava. We have used more of Pranava than Brahmari. Pranava, because for me, Pranava and hypertension, we have found amazing benefits. 5 minutes of Pranava and your blood pressure goes down. It's quite amazing. Very, very amazing what can happen there. It is, we use a lot for hypertension. Two reasons. One, prolonged exhalation. Prolonged exhalation is happening. Prolonged exhalation, as I said, vagal tone. Reduces sympathetic, enhances vagal, autonomic balance. Good. Second thing, why is the person hypertensive? What's going on here? And what is going on here? The limbic system. The limbic system is constantly in a circle. Limbus means a circle. Limbic is circle. And that is why once you put something into the limbic system, that is the emotional part of you, it will keep on going round and round. And as it goes round and round, it becomes a very strong tornado or whirlpool. And before you know it, you are totally lost. That is why Swamiji has termed Chitta Vrittis as the whirlpools of the subconscious mind. Nobody else has termed it. They say fluctuation, modification, modulation. Very nice, dignified, diplomatic words. Swamiji translates Chitta Vrittis as whirlpools of the subconscious mind. And once you get caught into this, especially the limbic system, I'll tell you, it will just go on and on and on and on and on and on, and you'll be so lost, your blood pressure goes up. Now, how do you attenuate? How do you reduce the limbic activity? Very simple, chanting. The moment you start chanting, the moment you start humming, your limbic activity goes down. And there's actually a documented research at the National Institute of Mental Health in India that Om chanting, Om, Om, Om. They did a functional MRI and they found the limbic system area, the limbic areas, the activity went down when you did Om chanting. So it's very, very beautiful, very beautiful. And we all know it. If you are tense, what should you do? Start singing. Your tension will go away. That is the basis of Bhakti Yoga. That's the basis of bhajans. That's the basis of chanting. You are tense, start chanting. Om Namah Shivaya. Today is Shivaratri, the month Shivaratri. Every month is a Shivaratri. Om Namah Shivaya. 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 And automatically what happens? You have forgotten all your tensions because they don't exist anymore. The limbic system said, oh my God, I'm not wanted here. It went into hiding. And you are relaxed. So one is the peripheral effect of the humming, prolonging the exhalation. The central effect is deactivating the limbic overactivity. And then another, what happens is when you chant, you release what is called endogenous nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It dilates your blood vessels. So humming, researchers in Sweden, they showed that by humming, you increase the amount of nitric oxide. And now this has become a very, very strong theory. Brahmari increases nitric oxide. Pranava increases nitric oxide. Chanting increases nitric oxide. Internal, endogenous, not external. Remember, anything that comes externally, any chemical will have a side effect. If it is an endogenous chemical, you don't have to worry about side effects. And that is why when you chant, when you sing, when you hum, endogenous nitric oxide, vasodilatation. And that is why these practices, that's why I said chanting on the exhalation is more beneficial for the cardiovascular system than the respiratory. Because all these benefits are pointing towards cardiovascular, hypertension, increased heart rate issues. What we did was we did work on people who had arrhythmias. That is, the heart is not beating in the proper rhythm. And what did we do? Slow deep breathing, 6 breaths per minute. Again, formula 6 per minute. And those arrhythmias disappeared. It was amazing. It was actually one of those serendipity studies that happened in our lab in JIPMER. One of my colleagues was doing some work on deep breathing, and he happened to have someone who had an arrhythmia, tried out the deep breathing, and immediately the arrhythmia stopped. Immediately the arrhythmia stopped. He was recording the ECG, found the arrhythmia, started deep breathing, and the arrhythmia stopped. Went on to make a case series of it and published it. Amazing work. Slow deep breathing, nothing complicated. Not 16, 64, 32, nah, nothing. Slow deep breathing, and immediately the heart was reset into its normal pattern. Very powerful. Nowadays, what do they call it? Coherent breathing or something. Steal traditional teachings and give it a new name and patent it. That's the neo British East India Company. The new version of the British East India Company is these guys who take this coherent breathing, they call it. These guys have no coherence in their mind, and they are totally incoherent. Anyway, don't get me on that. Gangster Yogi will come out, and I'm really controlling Gangster Yogi this day. I'm actually getting mails from people, we are missing Gangster Yogi. But, you know, I don't know. It's sort of, maybe. He'll come out when it's right time. Nowadays, Gangster's right behind me. That's Swamiji behind me. I'm actually hiding. I'm hiding this one of me because that guy I'm hiding behind the curtain. he's hiding behind me. Jekyll and Hyde hiding behind the curtain. It's not really hide. Anyway, coming back. Laura brought up the question of carbon dioxide. You see, when we looked at that slide, if you will go back to that slide, I'll see if I can find it. That slide, okay, what has happened is I need to go and open it again because I ended the slide share. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, now I think it should be fine. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. I'll just come back to that. It was, yeah. If you look back at this, you will see that we talked about decreased oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, and acidity as being potent stimulators of your respiratory center. So what is happening normally? You breathe in, the oxygen comes to your tissues, you breathe out, carbon dioxide goes out. Now, when you breathe in, oxygen is taken to your tissues, the tissues have all the metabolic activity, they produce the carbon dioxide, and so the carbon dioxide has to be expelled, hence you are breathing out. So the natural system is that whenever there is more carbon dioxide, you don't want to poison your own system by a toxic metabolite. So nature says you better breathe out. This is how it is set up. It is very logical, very rational. This is what drives most people. Now, what we are saying in yoga is, you want to change the way things are driven. You don't want to be reflex driven. You want to change what happens up here. So what do you say? You are not doing much activity. You are sitting calm and quiet. That is where the asana is important. A firm, steady state of asana is maintained, and you are breathing, and you decide to slow down your breath and hold your breath. Now what is happening? You're not jumping up and down. Not much carbon dioxide is being generated by toxic metabolite because you are calm in a steady state. Slowly the carbon dioxide level starts to come up, come up, come up, come up, come up, come up. It hits the threshold. Your brainstem says, I better breathe out, I better breathe out, I better breathe out. And you say, I know what I'm doing. You small guy down there in that box, keep quiet. Big boss up here knows what I'm doing. And carbon dioxide goes up. It's oh my God, you're poisoning yourself. You're poisoning yourself. You say, no, I'm not poisoning myself. I know what I'm doing. And then when you are ready, you say, okay, I breathe out and carbon dioxide goes down. The whole process is you are overriding the reflex pathways. The reflex pathways say carbon dioxide has gone up, breathe. It's like people, oh my God, emergency. And you're like, keep calm. Big boss knows what I'm doing. Keep calm. And this is where you are moving from that Abhinivesha driven breathing pattern, survival instinct driven breathing pattern, to a pattern that says, I am going to live a life on my terms, not on the terms of some little guy in a box down there. You have changed the whole terms of your life. Now, in doing that, what is happening? Normally, for most people, the moment carbon dioxide hits the threshold, they breathe out. They never know what it feels like to have more carbon dioxide when you are healthy. Now, if you are a faulty breather and you have a respiratory pathology and you have too much of carbon dioxide, you are poisoning your system. That's different. But as a healthy person, they don't know that nobody's nervous system knows what it feels like. But what are you doing? You are healthy. You are normal. Yet you are elevating the carbon dioxide level consciously. And by doing that, the carbon dioxide that is increasing starts to have another benefit. It is not just stimulating your brainstem. It has another benefit, and that is vasodilatation. Now, in somebody who's poisoning the system, that vasodilatation may lead to shock because the blood pressure may fall too low. Most people, when they are in septic shock and when they are in toxic states where the carbon dioxide is high, they are in a shock. Their blood pressure has gone very low. Now, that's a pathological experience. You are having a physiological experience by your conscious, mindful modulation and transcendence of the reflex pathways. You are transcending consciously your reflex pathways. It's the same with pain. Somebody pricks you with a pin, ouch! Normal, perfectly normal. But what happens? You start to say, okay, let me sit in Vajrasana. It's painful. Let me sit a few more minutes. This asana is a bit tough. Let me do it for another 30 seconds. What are you doing? Consciously, mindfully, in a safe way, you are extending your pain threshold. And this is why you start to find that what people are jumping up and down for, you say, okay, fine, no issues. You are not becoming insensitive. You are becoming a person who is transcending the senses. You are sensitive. But instead of reacting to that pain, you are saying, fine, this is the pain that is good for me. This is the pain that is part and parcel of my evolution. And I will use that pain in a positive way to help me gain a higher control over my own functionality. There's a big difference here. But you have to be careful, because in trying to do that, people get into this crazy slogan, no pain, no gain. And that's a very dangerous slogan, because then everybody thinks you have to go out and kill yourself. Yoga is not about killing yourself for sure. Ahimsa is the first rule. So don't kill yourself. That it's not worth it. Okay. Anything that has you needing to kill yourself is not worth living for. Okay. It's as simple as that. Because if you kill yourself, you have no life. Okay. It's a paradox there. But it doesn't mean you have become too easy on yourself. You have to come out of the tamasika guna. You have to change your pain threshold. You have to change your carbon dioxide tolerance. You have to change all of this. Because then suddenly, instead of stopping for every small thorn, you actually start to enjoy the rose that is there. People are so caught up with the thorns on the rose, they don't even know the rose exists. Because every one rose will have 20 thorns on it. And people are so caught up with the thorns, they forget the rose. Everybody wants a rose bed. If you have 100 roses on your bed, that is 100 into 20, 2,000 thorns on that bed, mind you. People forget that part. Do we have that capacity to do the tough thing? That is what makes us a diamond. The diamond is the one who said, give me the treasure, I will tolerate it, I will manage it. But don't harm yourself. That is why ahimsa is such an important part of yoga sadhana. Being violent to yourself in your practice is not yoga. I see so many people who are violent to themselves in the yoga practice. No. But it doesn't mean you let yourself be lazy. How do you know whether you are being lazy or not? And yes, as Laura says, psychological tolerance and acceptance. Very important. Very important. This greatest aspect is acceptance. Can we have acceptance of ourselves as we are, and yet know that we can grow into something more? It is not a passive tamasika acceptance. This is what I am. This is what I am. This is what I need to do. And I'm going to do what I need because I owe it to myself. I accept myself as I am with my limitations. But then it is my dharma to outgrow my limitations. And as I outgrow them, each day is an opportunity for another form of acceptance. I accepted myself when I was in high school. Fine, good. I don't stay in high school forever. I graduated from high school. I went into college, accepted myself in college. I had to graduate out of it. Every day is a new challenge. But every day, there is a very beautiful concept of acceptance. Because without acceptance, action cannot occur. Acceptance is the first stage before you can act. Because if you are not in acceptance, you are in denial. And if you are in denial, you are never going to act. It's like that guy who doesn't want to get out of the White House. As long as you deny it, you're not going to do anything. Huh? Deny it. See, you have to accept, then you can do something about it. I think one of the key aspects of yoga is acceptance. But it is an active, dynamic, living acceptance. It's a very beautiful state. And same thing with others. Just because somebody was nasty to you yesterday doesn't mean they're going to be nasty today. So yesterday you accepted them as the nasty person in your life. Today they may not be the nasty person in your life. They may have changed. Can you accept the change? Are you willing to accept their change? You're like, Dr. Ananda, why can't you just teach us how to get samadhi and kaivalya, and why do you have to tell us all this stuff? Well, that's what yoga is. Yoga is every moment living, and realizing that we live in a universe that is always changing, eternally changing. Are we able to accept the change? Are we able to adapt to that change and do what we need to do at that moment? Very, very important. So I think we'll stop there today, and we only got through the respiratory system, and another day for the cardiovascular, though we got a little bit of cardiovascular through the exhalation. Thank you for taking your time out today for this, because it was short notice, but I'm sure that this video will be much better than if I try to make one speaking to myself, because I do enough of that. So having you all there, seeing all of you, makes my day more wonderful. We are on Diwali Eve here in India. So happy Diwali. And tomorrow we have Diwali. And then on Sunday, Divya has asked me that we have a Diwali get together where I'll tell you some stories about Diwali. And Divya will sing you some songs for Diwali. And we are working on an English song for Diwali that I have written, and she and I will try to sing. So a lot of stuff coming up, a lot of gifts, because all of you are such wonderful gifts in my life that I always feel I have to give you more and 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 more. Om Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu Sarve Janaha Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Om. Love you all. Have a wonderful time wherever you are, and you can hear all the gunshots in the background. I'm in the middle of the battleground here with gunshots on all sides, you know. Diwali. Again, limbic system says, ah! Upper part says, it's Diwali. This too shall pass.